In today's episode, I'll be making bone broth, and I'll be explaining its versatility in 18th century foods. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. Bone broth has really had a modern resurgence, especially in the last couple decades, and very recently it's gotten very popular. But bone broth has a very rich and deep history from the Middle Ages, and especially very versatile and used in so many dishes in the 18th century. So first, let's talk about what we're covering here, bone broth, especially its modern interpretation. Bone broth is a meat and bone combination, usually a sort of a difficult to use cut or a leftover, like a chicken carcass or something like that. It's cooked for a very long period of time at a fairly low temperature, something just right around boiling or a little bit lower. And usually spiced and has some other things like onion in it, and used for soups and broths, and it's very valued for its nutrition that it carries along with it, as well as its frugality. So there's so many different recipes I could pull out of 18th century cookbooks to give you an example of bone broth. The one we're using today is from Elizabeth Cleland's New and Easy Method of Cookery from 1755. This recipe she calls a rich broth. We're going to start off with 3 pounds of a beef houk, and that is a Scottish term for a cut of meat that today we call a shank. In some 18th century cookbooks, it might be called also a shin, a beef shin, and they might even refer to it as a skink. Some of these terms are very kind of confusing. Similar recipes also call for other difficult to use cuts of meat, like the scrag end. If you see a scrag end, that means the neck. And you'll see like beef neck used in this, sometimes mutton neck. But all these are the same thing. Very difficult to use cuts of meat. The shank here has got lots of connective tissue. It's a hard-working muscle, so it's very, very tough and difficult to cook in any other way. So many, many times they used it in a broth. This one's so simple. We've got our 3 pounds of meat with the bone in. We also have good clean water, and we've got salt in this recipe, and we've got some spices, and they vary depending on the recipe. This one's got pepper, it's got allspice in it, and some mace. Most of the 18th century cooking methods really fall into 2 camps. Either you can take your pot and put this in it and cook it over a low fire for 4 to 6 or sometimes as much as 12 hours, tending the fire all the time, keeping it on a low simmer. Or at times they put this in a cooking pot and slid it into the oven and had it bake for a long period of time, probably even overnight, so that this would cook down. Now we could certainly do this on the stovetop, but we're going to do this the easy way today. We're going to use a slow cooker. Most of the 18th century recipes really didn't talk too much about how long to cook this, at least in time-wise. They really referenced what's happening to the meat that's in the dish. They say things like cook it until it turns to rags, or until all the goodness is out of the meat. So let's get started with getting this cooking. Normally we just put our meat down in the bottom of our dish. Now let's add our spices. We've got our salt first and our other spices. We're going to pretty much fill this up, and we're going to put this on low. We're going to let this cook a good long time. You can cooking overnight is great, or you can set this to start cooking before you go to work, and it'll probably be done when you get back. You can let this cook even longer if you really want to. 12 hours, 24 hours even, to really extract everything out of the meat and the bones. This smells great. The meat is nice and tender. This does a great job, releases all those great nutrients. This is wonderful. The recipe calls for removing the meat, remove the bones, and strain this off so that you take out all the shreds of meat. So there's so much we can do with these items now that we've got them to this state. The meat that's left over here, This is perfect for potting. This potted meat is very common in the 18th century. They'd take the meat that was very cooked like this. They'd chop it up, mince it up. They would grind it in a mortar and pestle even, so that they would make it very, very fine. Then mix it with clarified butter. And then they would actually put it in a pot, like our canister here, and then cover it over with clarified butter. And that clarified butter would stay liquid, and you could store that for a great period of time. When you wanted to eat some of that, you could just dip it out with a spoon and use it as a spread or something else. And the clarified butter would seal right back over the top of that, and you would be able to take out servings as you go. The broth here is the basis for so many dishes. Most of the soups are going to use a broth like this. You'd also use this broth as a basis for a ragu. So it's used in so many of the dishes. When this is completely cool, it'll be very easy to remove all the fat off the top of this broth. If you strain this broth through a cloth and then gently simmer that and reduce it and continue to reduce it, you'll end up with a very thick gelatin, which is the precursor to a portable soup, which we'll probably cover in a future episode. In our next episode, we'll take this broth and we'll turn it into a springtime asparagus soup. I want to thank you for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.